Thank you, Catherine. So this is our fourth roundtable, I think. So welcome to our roundtable. We are still waiting for some guests to arrive and some members to arrive. But I'm Sandhya Iyer from the HR department. I'm here to represent the Seven Oaks Chamber of Commerce, who are holding this employment law and HR roundtable, where local businesses specializing in employment law and HR come together, come around the table. We talk about issues that we face on a regular basis. And today we've actually got Ceri from West Kent Mine. Thank you so much for joining us. The reason particularly I invited Ceri, I've known Ceri for a while now, but I invited Ceri to this forum only because we are finding as HR and employment law practitioners that mental health of the workplace is really increasingly becoming a real issue for employers to manage. People are grappling with it, which kind of brings me to one of the examples that I was going to quote today. This meeting is being recorded. It will be shared, but I just think opening out this meeting with this example opens up this conversation about how far do we take mental health of the workplace, what are the boundaries, what is the requirement for an employer vis-a-vis a very difficult situation with an employee. So in the example that I'm going to talk about, so we had one of my clients, they work with young people who are vulnerable. They come from, they either come as refugees into the country, or they sort of young children who are leaving care, young adults who are leaving care. And this is a client that provides, becomes the anchor for these young people to lead a meaningful life. Besides providing things like housing. And one of the key workers, being employed only for about 3 weeks within the business, she made a disclosure one morning that she had attempted to take her own life. She was in hospital as a result. And not just that, she made a disclosure that she's been suffering from borderline personality disorder. This was the first ever time this employee was made aware, the manager was made aware of this, and the manager rang me in a panic saying, Sandhya, given the work that we do, there is absolutely nothing I can do to put this employee out to work, especially given that some of our own service users, our own young people, show tendencies such as this, and we as key workers are required to guide them through it, to support them through it, give them the right tools in life. And our key workers are meant to be role models to these young people. So given the very nature of the job, the core element of the job that we do, I cannot put her out to work. And from my end as an HR person, obviously, we looked at whether there was a risk assessment that had been done. What is the risk assessment now if the risk assessment was not really done? The health and safety people came back saying, there is definitely a very escalated level of risk in this situation if you put her out to work. I, from an HR employment law perspective, tried to see whether there were any other jobs that we could fit this employee into within the business. And it turned out that there was only a project manager's position. Any position within this business meant that this individual would have to engage with a young person. So having looked at different aspects there, we had to take the very hard decision, given that she was still on sick leave, still recovering from whatever had happened. I, of course, had the misfortune of sitting across this individual and having, or rather it was meant to go down that way. I would have had to dismiss her, given everything that we considered. But of course, she didn't come to the meeting. She ended up resigning and claiming discrimination and constructive dismissal, which, of course, that claim hasn't come through, but she said, I am going to bring in a claim, which we, of course, were always cognizant of that race. Now, I just would like to understand from Chris's point of view and Ceri's point of view, as an organization, as a small business, what else would you do in this situation to not just support the employee? I know this is about supporting the employee. I realize it's a very, very delicate case, but we also have clients who have who need that support, who need that help in dealing with situations like this. And beyond a point, operationally, they are absolutely not able to continue. My client is answerable to local authority, for example. So where do you draw that line? How would you deal with a situation like this? Over to you.
Chris, go for it. It'd be interesting to hear the kind of legal view, I think, really.
Crikey, what an awful situation to be in. Sanjay, can you just sort of go back a stage for me? The meeting that was convened, what was the purpose of the meeting, and how was it related to the individual concerned? Because she resigned as a result of you convening the meeting.
So we obviously, the manager explained the background of the meeting to her and said, look, you've got 3 weeks. It was very delicate to even talk to her. So, you know, we had to put things in writing because she wasn't even answering her call. So the manager explained to her that, look, these are the options, you know, sort of, we have explored certain steps. And this is, you know, fundamentally, he told me what he sort of explained to her what I explained to you just now, and said this would be, you are invited to a short service, you know, sort of a potential termination meeting for short service. We went down that route, and one of the, you know, we didn't quote anything to do with mental health, but we basically said some of the substantial reason is a reason for considering a possible dismissal. We called it a possible dismissal, and we said you would need to come into the meeting because the business considers this quite a substantial reason to consider termination. However, obviously, you need to put forth your mitigating circumstances. Because we didn't have the option to speak with her at all before the meeting, but it was so, the business was just sort of wanting to resolve the matter. It was kind of put in writing to her. But yeah, it was considered to be an SOSR, potential dismissal for SOSR.
Okay, fine. I mean, from a legal point of view, it seems to me it was, you know, a really difficult situation to be put in, because you're balancing what are essentially competing jurisdictions. I mean, the fundamental point from the employee's perspective is you mustn't discriminate, and you must, as far as practicable, create a level playing field and make reasonable adjustments in order to enable her to perform her role without impediments and so forth. But having said that, the organization sounds as though it has an overarching obligation to the vulnerable individuals in its care, and you're not going to marry those 2 aspirations satisfactorily. I mean, I suppose one could sort of stand back and explore a full diagnosis, prognosis, get consultancy, analysis, occupational health. You know, one could have gone down all of that, and of course those issues could have been explored at the meeting. It's incredibly difficult, isn't it? Because I would say that the sort of utilitarian approach would operate in the circumstances where the duty to the vulnerable, you know, the stakeholders, the people you're providing the service to, trump the employees' rights. That's not to say you can legislate against to bring in a claim, because clearly you can't preclude her from doing so.
Yeah.
But if you can show that you've followed a reasonable strategy for very, very keen operational reasons, and that you've been placed in this very difficult position, but you have not reacted, you've not retaliated, you have given careful thought. It would have been much better if, of course, if you could have gone through the meeting, because all of the issues could have been explored. You could have invited her, for example, to have explained. Because possibly some of the important footprints, or the you know, the jigsaw pieces, such as what triggered this incident, you know, are not known, and because they're not known, they could be variable, and indeed they may be historic very quickly. That's not to say that was any guide to the future, but I can see why such a meeting would have been convened, and it seems reasonable to do that, in my view. I mean, clearly, if she does bring a claim, the starting point is it's not unreasonable to convene a meeting, and she wasn't dismissed. So you would object, or you would contest any claim of unfair dismissal or automatic unfair dismissal, and discrimination based on the fact that there was no terminating event. If there was, constructively or otherwise, you would say, well, that was some other substantial reason and or capacity, because she didn't have the capability for reasons of, you know, your overarching concerns, but what a difficult position to play out.
It was horrible, and I think it's easily been one of the most low points for me in my career, just because I had to kind of, sort of take this further after, when she was in hospital, when she was still recovering in hospital from this whole thing, and I had to sort of have this meeting, which understandably she didn't attend. But then, of course, I drafted a whole sort of elaborate response, kind of including some of the things that you've just outlined. One of the things that I did consider, was what, occupational health involvement. And I thought to and this is something that, Chris, I know you touched upon occupational health. For me, when I spoke to the client's motto is giving young people the tools to sort of lead, a strong and meaningful life. And when you translate that into a key worker who's struggling, grappling with borderline personality disorders, I could see an immediate sort of clash there, a conflict sort of in the whole. Conflict of interest is a bit of a strong word, but you can see where this is going. But for me, I thought, okay, even if you refer this individual to occupational health, whatever they said in terms of reasonable adjustments, what are the reasonable adjustments that the business can really make? Because every job that there was out there for this individual to do required interaction with a young person who was already vulnerable. And I couldn't see the benefit of an occupational health report making a material difference to her role or any other adjusted role. What are your thoughts on that?
Yes, I mean, I have every sympathy for the way the route you went down, and I'm not sure I would have done anything differently. I suppose one option is simply to have placed her on sick leave and actually pause and just give yourself as much time as necessary to investigate the issues, because on the one hand, having somebody who struggles or has conditions or is neurodiverse in their own right, possibly is a very positive role model for vulnerable young people coming through, and say, look, we're not neurotypical. Everybody everybody reacts differently to different situations, and if you're slightly outside, so if you like, those sort of parameters, that doesn't necessarily stop you going on to leading a fulfilling life and so forth. But in an instance where actually the role is to look after people, that's, to my mind, where it steps over a line. And if you've explored those options, as you grasp the nettle. You dealt with an incredibly difficult situation from a legal perspective. It's difficult to see there would have been a different outcome, whatever process had been followed. But I can see sort of other options, as I say, just getting more information, pausing, but whether it would have ultimately made any difference.
This is the thing. I was thrashing out all different options in my head, and I was thinking, what is going to be the end result here in terms of having this employee out there to work and put her out confidently, be answerable to local authority, put her out confidently one-to-one, because sometimes they will be lone working with a young person. These care workers will be working alone with a young person. So all of that put together, and I couldn't, and of course I had to listen to to what my client wanted as well. Of course, clients sometimes I'm not going to say that the client will always get everything they want, because obviously our job is to try and protect the client and also advise them. But in this situation, I could see what the needs of the client, that they were valid in terms of their hands were tied to some extent. They couldn't get away with putting out somebody who'd made such a strong disclosure one-to-one with a key worker as well. So it's quite, but I'm just going to put the question to Ceri, that's all right. Ceri, where an employee makes such a disclosure, I know you talk about mental health first aid, in a situation like this, could you just talk us through what could have been done differently, or or even proactively, or lessons to be learned from a situation like this?
Was it the first time they became aware of her diagnosis of borderline personality disorder?
Just out of the blue, because she just texted her manager one morning saying, I'm in hospital, I try to take my life, and just to let you know, I suffer from borderline personality disorder.
Okay, and so no, we don't know. Do you know since how long they'd had that diagnosis?
This is the thing. The questions were asked, but responses didn't come through, because I just don't think she was in the stage to kind of even engage with
it. Yeah, okay. I mean, hindsight is a wonderful thing, right? I guess learnings for the future for that organisation may be around trying to create more of an atmosphere, more of an environment where it's actually okay and acceptable to make a disclosure about a mental health condition sooner, so that some support can be offered, so that they feel supported. Chris kind of touched on it, that actually somebody who lives with a mental health condition, lives with mental ill health, or is neurodiverse or has challenges of a particular sort, can be an incredible peer support and role model for young vulnerable people, for anybody. That's, of course, you have to balance that out with the risk. I completely understand that. But being able to create workplaces where the environment is one of openness, honesty, and perhaps if that key worker felt they'd been able to make a disclosure about their diagnosis sooner, then some more proactive support could have been put in place for them before reaching crisis point, before reaching that point of ending up in hospital. And I don't know what the ethos is within that organisation around mental health. Do they have mental health first aiders? Do they have staff teams had anything like mental health awareness training?
They've had mental health awareness training, but I just don't think that, to my knowledge, there is no mental health first aider, qualified, certified first aider there. But that was going to be my question to you. What is the function of a mental health? I mean, I do understand how first aid works. Obviously, we all have seen that sometimes even in action, sadly. But when it comes to mental health first aid and this sort of a disclosure, how do you marry up the two? Practical terms.
I mean, a mental health first aider isn't there for ongoing support necessarily. It's around recognizing when somebody's in distress, offering them some comfort, reassurance, and guiding them, signposting them on to further support. So ideally, in a perfect world, a mental health first aider within that organisation may have noticed that this particular person was struggling a little bit, wasn't themselves. There would probably have been some signs that they were potentially approaching crisis point. And so may have been able to have a conversation with this key worker to say, I'm concerned, you don't seem yourself, is everything okay? I'm here to listen, and to then guide them towards support through the organisation and externally. I mean, I assume that this key worker is already under care of a GP or a community health team for their mental health.
I see, this is the thing we don't know, because she was only with us for about 3 weeks, with my client for about 3 weeks when she made this disclosure, and now she's not an employee anymore.
Right.
So no, I mean, even I don't know.
So she's very, very new to the organisation.
Yeah.
Right. Okay. So actually, it sounds like there wasn't much of a window for anybody to become aware of what her baseline was and to notice that she was in distress anyway, which makes it even harder. I think Chris kind of touched on the idea that just pausing and putting her on sick leave, if you like, could have been a way to go, to just take stock before taking any action around further procedures. I appreciate that's not always ideal, but
in this situation, it was a tricky one.
And no two situations are the same, are they? I mean, ideally, I think, being able to say, okay, look, you're on leave, and let's set up a meeting just to discuss how we can support you, rather than a meeting where there was clearly an agenda that was bigger than how can we support you.
Yeah, I'm just going to extend that point onto one of the questions we've got here, actually. Rose Chan sent in a question. she says, how far do obligations to support mental well-being in a small business, how far do they have to go? Example, the need for a mental health first aider, which is exactly what we're talking about. And yes, I do agree with Chris. We do have employees who remain on sick leave. We refer them to occupational health. It's a mental health condition sometimes. And we implement the reasonable adjustments, or even the sickness procedure is slightly tweaked in terms of the monitoring parameters, for sick leave records, and we kind of make those adjustments. In this case, of course, it had to be an SOSR dismissal, which came up straight away. But in most cases, we follow that procedure, but try and make certain allowances within that procedure for somebody who's suffering from mental health. But I think I'm going to put this question first to Chris. Chris, how would you answer Rose's question?
The question, just to restate it to make sure I'm following it, is sort of what or balancing the process, if you like. So she's saying, how far do obligations to support mental health well-being go in a small business? But because tribunals consider what is reasonable for a specific employer, what would another similar employer have done? So for us, keeping in perspective the needs of a small business employer, how far does an employer have to go in satisfying those obligations to support mental health in the workplace? Yeah, it's quite a difficult sort of thorny question to answer, because ordinarily reasonable adjustments are not necessarily considered to be necessarily, the bar is sometimes not particularly high for employers, in terms of, for example, if it's mobility, making sure there's a ramp, or it's accessibility, or if somebody can't walk up and downstairs, switching their upstairs working environment to downstairs. They're not necessarily expensive, and they're not often difficult to roll out. With mental health issues and well-being, you have sometimes a much more problematic area, because it's not necessarily about throwing money at it. It's about support, an open dialogue, exclusivity, support primarily. And if you can establish those issues, they don't necessarily have a sort of tangible cost, but the sort of the environment is going some way to then being positively in place to put in and look at positive adjustments and adaptations. So it's difficult to sort of put a pound sterling and pence figure. There's not necessarily, I would suggest, a sort of, small to medium enterprises ought to be looking at, a cost of, £7,500, picking a totally fictitious figure. I don't think you can tick that off and say, well, we were willing to go that far, but no further, and that is reasonable, because the underlying thing is you shouldn't discriminate. But against that, individuals tend to present with different characteristics and different conditions that need to be viewed, although you can draw a common thread. The responses ought to be creative and flexible insofar as practicable, because the bottom line is you still need to have an operational business, and you still need to be able to roll out your services to clients, and you are often trying to balance what are slightly competing interests when looked at objectively. But reasonable adaptations, for example, could be giving more rest breaks, or more time off, or more focused instructions. They're not necessarily, because the conditions that can present are myriad. At sort of one end, they're relatively minor, and it may just be checking on somebody and talking to them about anything other than work. The football or the weather or the holidays or whatever it might be. The fact that what have you, and at the other end, it could be very full on, and possibly making sure there's a very much more controlled environment, or indeed an exclusion from work, because it's a an anxiety point, tipping point. But so I'm actually finding it rather difficult. I'm probably waffling, so forgive me, but I'm finding it very difficult to answer because I don't think one size fits all, and it's difficult or dangerous to talk in generalities if it's been treated as guidance.
But I think I see where but the difficulty when you don't have a specific example, and of course Ross is not here with us, but when you don't have a specific example, it's difficult to state because everything is down to the detail, isn't it, in terms of how you respond. But going by my own experience of these things, I would say more recently where, an employee was absolutely, I think I spoke about it at the roundtable a couple of months ago, an employee was just absolutely refusing to come into work. It didn't have anything to do with COVID, it was purely to do with anxiety, but not to do with COVID. The individual was just chronically suffering from anxiety and didn't want to come into the workplace and mingle with people. And it was really affecting, given the nature of the job, it was affecting the deliverables of his role. And we referred him to occupational health. When we tried to implement the adjustments recommended by occupational health, gave him more than the recommended timetable for a phased return to work. When we put all that in, and I knew that sometimes, when you're suffering from anxiety, you're putting something in writing, which involves so much detail because the individual refuses to engage with you on a face-to-face meeting. You say you'll come and see them, at a place of convenience for them. They refuse. Every opportunity to try and have those conversations is refused, is turned away. And so you really are left with very little option but to put things in writing, which I realize is just horrible for somebody who's suffering from chronic anxiety to take in all that detail in one shot. But anyway, we put in all of that on paper to say, this is the advice from occupational health, but we're giving you an additional 6 weeks, gradually to phase you back into the workplace. And the next thing, the employee has said, not having this, leaving. Of course, we haven't, this is more than 3 months now. So, we haven't had a claim, which is positive for the employer. But I just want to say that I don't think every employer sets out with the objective to get rid of an employee. They want to work with the employee, especially in a small business environment. Everybody knows everybody. It's a social environment. They want to work with the employee. They want to support them. But sometimes it just doesn't work out in that manner, much to the frustration, I think, of small business employers. And again, Ceri, I'll be turning to you. When you have somebody suffering from chronic anxiety, you think you've done everything to support them and help them. What are your solutions for a small business employer?
I'm not.
Or recommended advice
Wow.
for a small. What is a recommended advice for a small business? In terms of what we could do in addition to what's being done.
With the caveat that I don't think I can give solutions, certainly I can give you my view on it. So I think there's some interesting things to consider, and Chris made a really valid point that it can sometimes help if we compare what would a small business do if somebody was experiencing a long-term physical health complaint or physical disability. What adaptations might we make? How far would a small business be willing to go to support them in making adjustments or in a phased return to work, for example? And it can be worth drawing some parallels there, in that you would, hope they'd go as far, if not further, to support somebody whose illness was mental illness rather than physical illness. But as Chris so rightly pointed out, the adjustments that you have to make or the support that you need to put in place is different. It can be less tangible. And in this particular circumstance that you mentioned, Sandhya, around the employee living with severe anxiety, it sounds like as long as a collaborative approach was taken in terms of discussing with the employee in conjunction with occupational health, what would help you, what adjustments would help you, so as long as it was that collaborative approach, what is often meant helpfully but isn't always helpful is when these plans are kind of made without any input from the employee, and the team think that they're doing the absolute best thing but are perhaps making some assumptions about what's best for the employee without asking for their input and collaboration. So a collaborative approach has to be taken. And there are things like wellness action plans and wellness recovery action plans. There are various tools that can help to formulate these returns to work. But there can come a point, as in this example, where the organisation is doing everything within their power and more, and has followed, you know, a collaborative approach, and made sure that the employee inputs into this and feels involved and feels valued, feels that their thoughts and their voice and their opinions about the process are heard. But they are then not willing to engage, and not willing or able to accept the support that's being offered. And unfortunately, there is a point at which you can't do any more. There really is. And where the employee feels for whatever reason that actually this isn't the role for them, this isn't the business for them to be in, or, you know, an exit strategy from one side or the other is formulated, because you can offer as much support as you can, whether it's at work or outside of work, but at times somebody just isn't able to engage, and it may be that they are too unwell to engage.
We see that a lot. We see
And
that a lot.
you
Which makes our job, I think, quite difficult. Because it's all about consultation. It is, well, I say it's all about consultation to some extent. Yes, you do consult. You are, as an employer, obligated to carry out the recommendations from occupational health. But yes, you do want to consult with the employee. But one of the most common hurdles we see when engaging with staff who's suffering from mental health is that they just don't want to talk to you. I don't know whether Chris finds that, but I see that. I have to say, since the pandemic, what I have seen more often of is suicidal tendencies, which makes it really hard, very hard.
I mean, I agree entirely with what Ceri is saying in terms of the collaborative approach, because if you reach out and you're welcoming and embracing of ideas, you can't then be criticised, and at least if you show willing, it's a very positive stance, and hopefully that you know, predicated on that, you can agree a working way forward. If you can't, at least you've identified that you've explored those, and you know, those avenues, and to the best of your ability, or as far as reasonably practicable, you have come up to a blind, you know, dead end, as it were. And it seems to me that you've gone then as far as reasonably you need to. Our experience, just sort of departmentally, is I've not recently had sort of people threatening or looking to commit suicide as such, but we've had a lot of middle managers who've been out of, you know, working flexibly for the last couple of years or so, and they're now supposed to be going back to work, leading their teams, and often in a sales capacity, hitting the road and going out, pressing the flesh, sort of, you know, reintroducing themselves to customers physically and holding physical meetings, and they are displaying terms of anxiety and stress, which actually a lot of our corporate employees had not anticipated. You know, the support would be there, if you like, for more sort of junior people, but I hadn't expected their quite senior people to be anxious about coming back in and hosting meetings, and, you know, leading meetings, and, as I say, just going out and re-engaging with, and that's been quite interesting, because it's often not legal work in a sense. I feel it's more so, and it's not in counselling, because I'm not a trained counsellor at all. You know, I should stay away from anything like that, I suppose. But it's just talking through the issues and saying, well, what could you do? What could we explore? What, you know, just conjuring rather than, and, you know, and just trying to say, well, look, have you thought about doing certain things that would create a conversation and kickstart that dialogue, and just explore where it goes and see how supportive you can be. But that's a new, sort of relatively new one to me, because that has not been previously, you know, perhaps before Christmas last year, people were saying, the sort of the mental health issues, the well-being issues were directed because people were feeling isolated. They wanted to come back to the work environment. They were felt unsupported. There wasn't sufficient communication. People were not setting up, electronic sort of or remote meetings to have coffee mornings, at work. All of that sort of stuff was going on. Latterly, it's now, okay, we've got to come back. We're going through a sort of, amber light. We're waiting for the green. We don't want to come back, or not in that, wholehearted, disciplined manner. We want something a lot more soft. So some of their soft skills, if you like, talking, confidence, has been lost. But Ceri, I don't know again if that's your experience.
No, absolutely. And I think even people who were feeling very isolated at home and wanted the feel of, the kind of, to regain that team feeling, that sense of being part of something that you get from working in the same place, even people who were so keen for that are finding that actually they have lost some of their confidence and are worried about going back into face-to-face situations. Lots of people have also, reviewed work-life balance and thought about some of the positive things that have come from working at home, and understandably are reticent to leave some of that behind and go back to full on back in the office. So that hybrid approach to part working from home, part working from the office, I think is popular for very valid reasons. But there is certainly anxiety around getting back into social situations, into face-to-face meetings where everything has been behind a screen. And wherever possible, of course, organisations need to be supporting their employees to build their resilience back up, to build their self-confidence, to find tactics and tools for tackling those feelings of stress and anxiety to help them perform in their roles, that encompass so much more than legal requirements. It's somebody, especially managers, their role is so much more than just day-to-day tasks, isn't it? It's helping to manage a team as well and support a team, and they have to feel supported themselves as well. Managers are in that vulnerable position where they have a team to support, but they need to feel that they have support as well.
Speaking of managers' mental health, I've thought of another situation actually just as we're speaking. We've got about 15 minutes more, so I'm just looking at the clock. So Chris, just let me know if you have to leave. But this was again a situation that we hit upon last year during the pandemic. Yes, managers have been up against it, trying to hold their own lives together while supporting their staff. And there was another situation where, yes, we all talk about social media policy in an employee handbook. We talk about, how banter is never going to be tolerated within the workplace. There are employees who have, employers who clearly say zero tolerance and all of that. But this was again a situation where a manager, rightfully so, managed an employee. There were performance management, some was related to performance management, but not major. The employee was never going to be dismissed for performance. But anyway, there were claims raised for for specific aspects, or not claims. There was a grievance raised for specific aspects of the work. It wasn't upheld, and finally, this employee decided to leave the business and engage in social media trolling. Again, being a small business, everybody knows everybody. You end up being friends with your colleagues. You end up being friends with your manager's friends. It's so intertwined, all these connections. And that really hit this manager pretty hard, mentally, so much that it just kept going on and on. And from an employment law perspective, there was little that we could do. We sent out cease and desist letters, but I think beyond a point, it became a civil matter because this employee was no longer employed by the business and still engaging in trolling. In that situation, how do you support a manager? And that has been another challenge. We are continuing to support this manager. We are continuing to, it's about lessons learned. And without mentioning names, we do quote these, examples. I'm a strong believer of having these forums with staff of lessons learned, maybe on every 2 months. One of the things is we've learned is this is the real effect you see of on mental health when somebody does X, Y, and Z. You know, you've got a colleague here who is grappling with it. Not to make an example out of anybody, yes, you take consent, but I think this manager was very open, said, I really would like to share my example as a, you know, my story as an example with staff, just to make them realize how, you know, the damaging effects of banter, be it within the organization or on social media, where you're hiding behind the facade of Facebook or whatever. Yes, there's therapy in place, there's EAPs in place as a business-based supporting. What else could you do to prevent something like this? Education, yes, but you know, sometimes I feel a bit helpless because no matter how much you support an individual, you can see the effect something like this is having on them.
Yeah, and we sometimes call them keyboard warriors because people are very they're not just robust, they're vicious when they don't have to look you in the face. You know, I get very cross at my firm when third parties or even clients are step over a line, because you know, fair comment, criticisms, you know, constructive dialogue, don't have any problem with that, but there are instances where it goes beyond what I believe is reasonable and acceptable. In the situation you're detailing, I suppose you could have a twofold approach. Insofar as it's necessary, the legal route is to write to somebody and give them a very stern cease and desist, because that's in the public domain, and that is detrimental, it's defamatory. Making those sorts of inimical comments are, you know, clearly prohibited behavior. Internally, perhaps a more and whether that ultimately ends up in an injunction, I think depends how bad it is. But you can at least put a marker down. But I think internally, having a dialogue and perhaps getting their staff together, particularly if they're all engaging and they're all still friends. I don't mean they're also
I see
involved in slagging slagging off the manager, but they are nonetheless recipients and you know, receiving those posts. If you sit them down and explain what had gone on and why it's unacceptable, and actually looked at in the cold light of day, it has now crossed the line and is becoming harassment and victimization, and you know, the effect of that on this individual is very, you know, unfair and uncharitable. You might find that sort of creatively gets the message back in actually a more productive manner, if you like, than a direct legal route, because I would see this as challenging that behavior. You know, the individual may be off on some sort of crusade of their own, so they need to be brought to sort of you know, brought to heel slightly, and a direct legal approach is not always necessarily the best route. I think it should possibly a sort of a parallel strategy would be a useful one in such a situation.
It would also help to really show the manager who remains, and obviously, as you said, Sandhya has been quite open about what has happened and about how it's affecting them. I think it would really help to bolster support for them, to feel supported by the rest of the organisation, the rest of the team, in a kind of, you know, we're your team, we're here to support you, whatever this ex-employee is saying, we're a team, and this is the support that's in place for you, including every single member of staff. And actually that kind of links back to creating those supportive teams and those supportive workplaces.
Forums, I call them the forums.
Where you can be honest, where you can be open and honest, whether it's about you're being harassed and bullied by an ex-employee on social media, whether it's about you're living with severe anxiety and finding it incredibly difficult to be in social situations. And it might be, you know, just thinking about the previous example that you mentioned, Sandhya, where the employee was very reluctant to come back to work. Part of it might be fear of being judged by their colleagues. And so creating that ethos, that environment, that culture where it's okay to be honest And there is no fear of judgment. There's no stigma around it. There's no discrimination around somebody's experiences of anxiety, because that fear of being judged, of being stigmatized, is actually, people living with severe mental ill health report that that's far worse. The effects of that judgment are far worse than the symptoms of their mental health condition.
Yeah.
And it takes a huge amount of work and commitment from everyone within an organisation, top to bottom, to create that culture. And you have to carry on working at it all the time. But it's, it is.
I think in this situation, I have to say, I was working with an exceptionally brave manager who said, I don't mind for you to share my story as an example, because I just think staff need to see it. But I have to be honest, not everybody is able to do that, which then makes our job, because here you're right. I think lessons learned have to be shared. And that's how you walk and talk the culture of supporting mental health at work. It's not about putting it in a handbook and forgetting about it. It's about bringing these lessons to the table and talking about it. But I think you do need the cooperation and the understanding of the individual who's grappling with the mental health issue in the first instance. And in this case, I think I was just lucky that the manager was willing to do that. But going back to Chris's point, I think what we did there, Chris, was a combination of the legal side of things, where we sent out a cease and desist letter, and then we sat down with the employees to share this example. How much of that got fed back, we do not know. But I think, again, coming back to my example of a small business, we did explore the option of taking it beyond the cease and desist. And it was going to be very, very expensive. Plainly put, for a small business, it was going to cost them a lot of money to pursue that legally. So in a way, we almost said, all we can do is talk to our staff internally, support this manager. But we, as a business and as an employer, there was very little control, besides, of course, what the police were doing. As an employer, there was very little control that this business could have exercised in stopping trolling.
That's absolutely right. I mean, it is, if you're applying for urgent injunctive relief, the costs will run into thousands and thousands of pounds. Well, even blinking. Reporting it to the police as a criminal offence sometimes can pay dividends. The trouble with all of these strategies, in isolation, they can be a red rag to a bull. Sometimes somebody feels that they're being attacked. They come out, they're more belligerent as a result, which is not always helpful. The alternative is a civil claim, I suppose, under the Prevention of Harassment Act, because it's just 2 strikes and you're out rule. But of course, that's the individual having to do that. The company could support that, but then of course they become a third-party funder. So there are nuances within each strategy, and there are pros and cons. And sometimes one option, depending how public the posts are, is to say, well, we're going to turn it off. We're not going to engage.
No, nobody did engage. To be fair, nobody did engage. But I think ultimately this manager has left, or I don't know where it was. No, it was because the contacts were still contacts of this individual. So it was still getting fed through. You can still take snapshots and send it. And we just said, maybe just stop sending it. So sending snapshots, I don't think seeing it as benefiting anybody. Well, not to this manager, but I kept in touch with what was going on. With the permission of the manager, I kept in touch, but we ensured that we sort of protected the manager from seeing these posts on a regular basis. But it was difficult again. Quite a few of these situations have come up in the last couple of years. But I think it's just been really useful to have your inputs.
Well, that sounds like a very positive outcome, in the sense that you managed to turn it around. So that the manager was now seen, if you like, not as the victim, but certainly as the person who was having this sort of harassment has been perpetrated on them. And I think that's very helpful, because actually then you get the natural sympathy and empathy from people, and they're much more willing to engage and be supportive in their own environment if they can see somebody's been picked on. So that message, that open communication, that collaboration, I think probably was a very positive reaction to that scenario.
I find I'm sorry.
No, I was just going to say, and so courageous of them to be so open about it.
I agree.
It speaks volumes for their courage and braveness. And actually, it's things like that that do help to create that culture where people are more open. One person does it and other people feel more able to be open and honest. And so, amazing.
I think especially coming from a manager, it does speak volumes. But I think fundamentally, I also find as practicing HR consultant, I just find that bringing those lessons learned back to the table is just so important. It's not about just addressing a grievance or a performance issue or whatever you deal with. I think without mentioning names, I find it useful to come back and talk and share those lessons with, of course, the permission of concerned parties. It does sort of help open up avenues for conversation at the workplace. We've got 2 minutes to spare, but no, thank you. I'm sorry, I don't know what's happened. We normally have a bigger number of people, a larger number of people attending, Ceri. So I will check with Catherine as to what's happened.
Don't worry.
If you are available, I still like what we discussed, and I'm hoping our members will be able to, take something away from this. So thank you so much for both, your time and Chris's time. But yeah, if you're available, we'd love to see you again on one of these roundtables.
Thank you so much for inviting me. And yes, I'd love to come back. Let me know when the next one is. And if I can, I'll be there. It was a real pleasure to meet you as well, Chris.
And likewise.
Yes, and you, Ceri, and I'll look out for Kate on the networking as well.
Yes, do. I'll let her know to look out for you. Thank you so much for having me. I found it useful, and I hope that you both have as well.
Definitely.
Thank you.